Good evening. I think I'm on. Are you on? Are you ready? We're ready. We are excited about the study. I'm sure we'll have others coming in. And Lee made a very good point. We need to tell the ones that come in late that we're actually starting on time. You know, there is so much material in this study that we really would like to cover as much as we can. No way we can cover it all. And so we know that you're reading with us, some of you. We have set this class up where if you haven't read, you can still gain from the material. We really set it up with that thinking in mind. So if you're reading, you're one step ahead of the game. But if you're not reading or you miss a week, come anyway. Don't skip. Because we've got it set where if you haven't had time, then you can stay with us and gain something from the material. We know how life is. We know it's crazy. So we want you to gain from the study. So let me just get a quick show of hands of the ones that are here. If you are, thank you. Thank you for the show of hands. Thank you. Man, tough crowd. If you are reading or plan to read, you've got the book, you're trying to read, let me see a show of hands for that, just so we kind of have a sense of who all is trying to kind of do that. So, I think Patrick or I, either one, would welcome emails, input. We're going to try with each class to have a little bit of time at the end for some processing. It's not enough. I mean, we could talk about it and discuss it for an hour probably or more. But a little bit of time at the end, if you want to do further processing, that's great. If you've got questions, I'll be glad to refer you to Patrick, and he'll be glad to answer those. So, Rosemary was very kind and offered an extra copy of the book that she had. If you are wanting a copy, haven't bought it yet, don't know how to buy it, where to buy it, whatever, see me afterward, I guess. First come, first serve. If you have the ability to buy one, then leave this for somebody else. But if you need one, glad for you to have this one. So we'll leave it there. Okay, so we're going to go pretty quickly tonight through about really 4 chapters, 1 through 4. And that's a lot of material to cover, but I think it'll make sense to you how we're doing that. Patrick will cover the science. I'll do some implications at the end, and we'll do the Q&A, and we'll be done. Really glad that you're here. Really happy that you're participating, and excited to share with you. So let's get started, and let's pray. Father God, creator of the ends of the earth, we know that you don't need our defense. We know that you don't need us to figure out that you're the creator. But Lord, there is something in the study of your creation and of seeing your fingerprints on what is made that encourages our faith. And it may also give us the ability to talk with others who may not yet see that. So bless the study. Bless us as we go through the material. Help us to have an open heart and open mind. We're also very thankful that there may be some here tonight that aren't in that place of seeing and knowing you as creator. Our hope would be that they feel welcome here and that they have an open mind to this material. And Father, in all things, glorify your name. There is always a lot of prayer requests on our hearts as well. I'm thinking of a few specific ones. We all have those things that we're thinking about, people we're concerned about, and so on. Father, we lift those to you. Hear the desire of our heart for healing, for your presence, for your touch, and please address those needs. So bless us as we present this material. Bless the ones that are receiving it, that are asking questions and that are wrestling through some of these concepts. We pray in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.
Am I loud enough to play?
Quick, one more note. We do have a handout at the end with some of the terminology some of the notation. I'm not going to give it to you until the very end, but if that helps you to know that, then you'll have that to take home with you.
All right, first thing, I was kind of reflecting on what I presented last week, and I wanted to make sure that I've been clear on one thing, and that is that we're trying to present this with gentleness and kindness. When I was talking about evolutionary creationists, I made the assumption that there might not be anybody in this room that was one of those. No one came up to me afterward and said anything, but in my mind as I was going through that, I was like, God can certainly act in that way if he wanted to. So to make that assumption was probably a little short-sighted on my case. And I think most of you know through my teaching that, and I even mentioned it in the sermon that I gave, that obedience is highly underrated and knowledge is highly overrated. So no matter what faction you fall under, Marshall and I are much more concerned about the obedience. So I at least wanted to just say that. Hopefully that comment didn't make anybody uncomfortable or scare anybody away. But I guarantee teaching subjects like this, I am going to offend someone over the next 11 weeks. It's almost a guarantee. So if that does happen, come up and talk to us and we'll get on our knees and beg for forgiveness. So, all right, so tonight we are going to talk about some of the icons of evolution. These icons are printed in textbooks still to this day. And a research article that I read yesterday from 2011 looked at 9 icons of evolution, and the 4 we're talking about today was in this study. And it looked at what textbooks they were in, and then they kind of gave those textbooks a grade on how they presented the material. These icons of evolution were in virtually every textbook, and the overall grade of how these icons were presented was extremely low. So it'll be interesting to walk through these tonight and get your guys' feedback. Through my teaching, I also talk about how I do not want your faith to be my faith. I don't want your faith to be Alpine's faith. I want your faith to be your faith. So I don't want you to take anything that I say here as fact. I want you to dig into it a little bit. We gave you some websites last week. We're going to give you some papers after class today. And we'll just challenge you to open your minds. And I wouldn't necessarily go to Wikipedia for your information, but dig in a little deeper. Find out what this means to you. And I can promise you, if you are allowing the Holy Spirit to guide you, then he's going to lead you in the right direction. Again, don't take my thoughts and make them yours. Take this information, go study it, and allow the Holy Spirit to develop this thought process in you. Okay, so the first iconic icon of evolution we want to talk about was the Stanley Miller experiment. Lee said that he remembers reading about this somewhere. Does anybody recognize this Stanley Miller experiment? And I realize you have to go dig deep a little bit, but this is a unique experiment from the standpoint of the 4 icons we're talking about. This is kind of the outlier, okay? The other 3 deal strictly with evolution. This is the one that is kind of offset, and it talks about really what we call abiogenesis. And that is how to create living things out of inorganic molecules. Okay? So this is talking more creation, and then the other 3 are going to be dealing with the evolution side. Okay? So this experiment was done in the early 1950s by Stanley Miller, and his goal was to artificially produce the building blocks of life. So he came up with, and it's actually a very thought-provoking experiment. So this was his setup. He had water here that was being heated. This was creating water vapor. So if you remember from Marshall's comments last week, that the early atmosphere that Miller was proposing was methane, ammonia, water vapor, and a lot of hydrogen. Okay? So he would pump those chemicals into this right here. All right, so water vapor mixes with these chemicals. He has electronic shock there. As those gases sink, they condense in a cool water bath that was wrapped around the tube. And then down here is where he would collect his red goo. All right, and that red goo is what he analyzed. Okay, he let this experiment run for several days. And in the end, there was certainly a red goo in the bottom of his flask. When he examined this red goo, what he found were amino acids. Amino acids are what we consider the building blocks of life. It's what our DNA, RNA, all of our cells are built out of, proteins. It is literally the building blocks of life. So you can imagine his joy when he finds out that he has amino acids, and he has created this out of inorganic molecules. It's a really fascinating theory, because if that's true, do we need an intelligent designer? So for those people that were strong into a non-creationist viewpoint, this was a home run for them, something they could kind of really stand on. So the first thing we'll talk about is just the fact that this really doesn't demonstrate how life might have naturally occurred, okay? And I'm going to start, my first two comments are just saying that let's just assume that this is a fantastic experiment and there's nothing wrong with it, okay? Let's assume that the atmosphere was exactly like what he proposed, and let's just look at the end result of his experiment, okay? He did get amino acids, okay? The catch was, though, he got what we call right-handed amino acids, okay? Human life is built on left-handed amino acids, okay? This is a concept called chirality. Chirality is very, very difficult to explain. I tried to make Andy explain it to me before class, and was going to call him up as a guest lecturer, but I told him I wouldn't do it. Chirality is molecules that are mirror images of each other, but they can't be superimposed. Okay? So they're the same molecule, but they have different views to them. Okay? And humans and life is supported by all left-handed amino acids. Okay? All of his amino acids were right-handed. Okay? So that's one huge inherent flaw in his study, if we give him credit that this study was correct to begin with. Okay? The next thing is that there were no macromolecules that were developed in this red goo. Okay? So we were still left with just a bunch of amino acids. All right? And he uses an example in his book of putting a cell in a test tube with an osmotic solution. Okay? He pokes the cell, and the cell releases all of its contents into this test tube. All right, so now we have a test tube in osmotic water that our bodies have osmotic water in them, okay? So it's a good substrate for life. Do you think that those scattered parts can ever come back together to reform a cell? So he used the term, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together. Okay? And I think that's a pretty good way to describe it. So again, in his experiment, he had amino acids, but they were all the wrong handedness. Then he had no macromolecules. He didn't have the necessary things to truly build life. Okay? So now kind of on the flip side of this is that science now would probably support that his atmosphere was nothing like what he ran it from. Okay? So instead of a very hydrogen-rich environment, this environment was more of a carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor. So scientists have rerun his experiment with this new atmosphere, and every single time they get the same result. And that is formaldehyde and cyanide. Okay? Which are hardly the best things to build life from. Okay? So experiment after experiment has come up with that same conclusion. So definitely find that interesting, that when we reproduce that, these molecules come into play, and unfortunately they don't support life. We're going to show a little video, which is just kind of a summary of what he talked about in his book, and I think it's a pretty good little illustration.
Strobel's search began with an examination of evidence that challenged materialistic theories of life's origin. He discovered that this negative evidence contradicted the textbook explanations that had once convinced him the blind forces of evolution could account for the creation and diversity of life on Earth.
A good example of negative evidence is the 1953 Origin of Life experiment by Stanley Miller, the one that helped lead me into atheism in the first place. As biologist Jonathan Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today, namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes you think that a few amino acids dissolved in the ocean are going to give you a living cell? It's totally unrealistic.
So kind of good, good little summary of his experiment. And I was talking to Ralph before class, and he made the same comment: is yes, we could have got amino acids. As a matter of fact, we see amino acids in a lot of different places, space being one of them. So we see amino acids being developed, but that's still a huge step to go from amino acids to the creation of life. So these points are going to be on this kind of study guide that we give you after class. And really, Marshall developed this just so you have something, if someone ever talks about this, you have a quick little reference guide to just 4 quick points that at least should raise some questions about the inherent validity of this study. So again, I used the term last week about sound scientific research. And I think that these are 4 at least good valid points that might put a little bit of dent into that armor of this study. All right, we're going to get to questions at the very end, so if you have any, just hold on to them, and we can talk about it. All right, next is Darwin's Tree of Life. Darwin created this as a metaphor used to describe the relationship between organisms. Some that have made it and some that have gone extinct. So when I always thought of the Tree of Life, you thought of a single tree that grows up and has all its branches. This was Darwin's original. And it's a little tough to see maybe in the back, but what you're seeing is the letters A through L here, okay? And these are all different species. This one survived through natural selection. Remember that term? Okay? So it had the necessary parts to make it through this timeline that he provides. And as it goes up, it continues to branch like that tree. You have others that just made it 1,000 years and then went extinct. You had others that started off with this same phenotype or how it looks, and it was exactly the same for all these thousands of years. Okay? So this to me looked more like a forest, right? It was a bunch of little trees, the ones that had the proper genetic makeup and the ability to adapt. Those are the ones that developed into the big trees. There were some that couldn't get the sunlight anymore, went extinct, right? And there's others that maybe just didn't get the food and just were kind of a big spindly tree, okay? That's kind of how I viewed Darwin's tree when I first saw this. So, interesting drawing. He published this in 1859 in The Origins of the Species. About 20 years later, Ernest Haeckel, who we'll talk about in a little bit, he's real famous for his embryo drawings. He drew what most people kind of considered the Tree of Life. That was more of the standard, just single tree with all these little branches that come off of it. Darwin's theory was based on something kind of simple, and it was that slowly, by accumulating slight successive favorable variations with no great or sudden modifications, that the species would continue to develop. So this is a very slow process over long periods of time, using the concept of natural selection. So the question in the book that was kind of posed, or maybe the illustration was, is do we see that in the paleontology or archaeological evidence of fossils? Because if Darwin's premise is true, you're going to see this slow progression of fossils through this tree. Okay? There is some information out there that would say that we don't see that in the fossil record. And the biggest example used is what's called the Cambrian explosion. This is a kind of geological phenomenon that science says happened about 540 million years ago. Okay? So Lee Strobel's writing this book probably as an old Earth creationist. Okay? And in this time period, we see a sudden burst of archaeological evidence in the fossil records of just massive amounts of development and new species coming on board. And it definitely goes a little bit against what Darwin said was his tree of life. We have another video for this, but before we watch the video, I do think it's important to differentiate. We talked about last week micro versus macroevolution. Okay? Well, this idea of a common ancestor in Darwin's tree of life, I think we certainly see in the species level. For instance, the number of dogs that we have. Okay? The number of cats that we have, from house cats to tigers to lions. We see that development within a species. Okay? but to take that back to a single descendant, I think is where the stretch occurs, okay? He does a really good job explaining this in his video, and he describes kind of his vision is this is like a lawn, okay? And each blade of grass is a different species, and maybe we've got some Bermuda that's got some fingers to it that would represent a certain species. So let's watch this, and I think it's a pretty good explanation.
Perhaps the most damaging blow to Darwin's theory is the fossil record. If all living organisms have descended from the same primitive life form, then the rock strata of the Earth should be filled with the fossilized remains of animals that were once part of a great evolutionary chain. A chain of small biological modifications, ultimately leading to a spectacular diversity of life. Yet, after 2 centuries of research, highlighted by excavations in southern China, the multitude of transitional experiments, or missing links, that should exist, are conspicuous only by their absence. The most graphic example of this void in the fossil record is a geological era known as the Cambrian explosion.
The branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory is actually not seen anywhere in the fossil record unless we impose it with our own minds. So the Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the tree of life.
The Cambrian explosion of life was a dramatic episode in geological history. Usually dated at about 530 million years ago, the exquisitely preserved Cambrian fossils reveal that the body plans for virtually every major animal phyla appeared, not gradually and slowly as Darwin had speculated, but instead with astonishing suddenness.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
In a geological instant, the animal kingdom leaped from small, relatively simple organisms to extraordinary creatures with spinal cords, compound eyes, and articulated limbs. The record of this explosion of life looks nothing like Darwin's slowly branching tree.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life, where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms, and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification, but even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life. As scientists, it's not our job to force the evidence into a theory that just doesn't fit. And so I have absolutely no desire or reason to uphold Darwin's theory at this point.
So that's a pretty strong statement, and a good way to end that video. The video mentions something that is the next icon, and that is a transitional fossil. So in that fossil record, you would think that if we are developing like a tree, that we're going to see those transitional animals that go from fish to reptile reptile to bird, and you're going to see those types in the fossil record. So the third icon is Archaeopteryx. This is a fossil that's been discovered 12 times to date. Okay, and this was announced as the transitional form between a dinosaur and a bird. So they're calling this the oldest bird ever found. Okay, had wings that they say has feathers on it, and then more of a dinosaur head. It only weighs like 2 pounds, so it's like the size of a raven or a hawk, so pretty small. This is one that comes with controversy as well. And the thing that I would tell you is that when they try to date this bird in his tree of life, it doesn't come where it should. Okay, so I think that's the big take-home message with this icon of evolution. There's a lot of other transitional fossils that have been found, and the vast majority of them have been deemed fraudulent. Okay, for instance, they'll find fossils and try to put feathers on them. Okay, and they'll flat out make up fossils to put on the black market. So there's a history of fraudulent transitional forms out there. So when you're reading through this research, be aware of that. One of the other transitional forms that they found was false. They were extracting DNA, and it was turkey DNA. So they had fraudulently put together a fossil with turkey bones. And he mentioned that in his book, I believe. Okay, so we got to keep rolling. Last one is Haeckel's embryos. This one is still in textbooks, and is probably the one that has been deemed the most fraudulent and thrown out the window. But still, as textbooks that were printed in 2013, we're still in. The idea here is that he had different animals, and he proposed that in the early stages of development, each of the embryos looked similar. Okay? This is what we call ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. How about that? Say that 20 times fast. What this means is that embryos repeat their evolutionary history by passing through adult forms of their ancestors. If we came from fish as an embryo, we're going to have gills. Okay? Does anybody remember in biology class the teacher saying that we had gills? We didn't. Okay? What those are called are branchial arches that form nerves in our face, neck, sternum. They look like gills, but they are far from it. Okay? Haeckel's embryos have been proven fraudulent from the standpoint of he drew these. Okay? And now when you see embryos in textbooks, now they're pictures. Okay? And this is what you now see in textbooks. Okay? So you can see that these embryos look vastly different. Okay? Humans being over here. So the similarities that he drew, completely fake. He also cherry-picked his examples. He picked embryos out of each category that he thought would look the same. And in reality, they don't. His drawings led to another theory called homology. And that is the idea that different structures in different animals look similar. Okay? So, for instance, the human hand, frog, bat, porpoise, and horse. So you can. I think it's actually kind of cool to see those similarities between animals. Does the fact that we see this prove that we were descendants of these? Rob?
I think it proves that God's a pretty good engineer.
Okay.
And he understands how things work.
So it very well could be that it's just a common archetype or design. Okay? Could be that the same genes run the development of these structures, and they're common within animals. Science has not figured this out. Okay? But just because an evolutionist stands up and says that this proves evolution, there's no proof there. Because as Ralph said, it's just as easy to say that the designer was smart and efficient and is using the same genetic structure to create those. So homology is something that you're going to hear and see when you do your research as well. So what time you got, Marshall? Okay, about finished a few minutes early. All right. So I buzzed through those last two because we really do want to save time for some processing of this information. But the end question we have to ask is, do these icons of evolution prove evolution or leave some questions in your mind about the sound scientific significance of these icons? And hopefully we've at least presented a few things that at least put a little red flag that says, you know what, we might question these. And again, if our kids hear these examples first in their lives, they're more likely to follow the icons versus the icon of Jesus and creation. So I challenge you to dig into it, and we'll have some scripture and then about 10 minutes of decompression.
So, just a few minutes to focus some thoughts, share some ideas. To start with, if you look at John's Gospel, chapter 18, there's this great moment where Pilate is trying to get to the bottom of who Jesus is. He doesn't really want to crucify him. And so, in verse 37, Pilate trying to kind of catch Jesus, he says, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." To which Pilate says, "What is truth?" What is truth? That's what we're trying to get at the bottom of. People have always been asking that. Would you like, you in the room here tonight, would you like to know what truth is? Anybody care about truth? That's, yes, I'm awake. Yes, I care about truth. I don't want to be misled. Okay, all right. Thanks for sticking with me there. So if you care about truth, then you want to get to the bottom of things. Science cares about truth. And I believe they really do, for the most part, care about truth. So you have this quote, "Science is the search for the truth." Right on. We all want truth. Pilate wanted truth. Jesus said, if you want truth, you'll listen to me. But science is saying we want to search for truth. Now, what's interesting is it begins to diverge from truth and become more philosophical. So philosophical belief that isn't necessarily based on that verifiable evidence. What's your term that you've used?
Sound clinical research.
Sound clinical research. So it starts with a naturalism. I believe that things had to have spontaneously come about, the abiogenesis, right? So if you start with that as a philosophical belief and you try to work from that, then you're starting off with something that can't be proven, and then you try to begin to prove that. That becomes a lot of what science does in my estimation. That's the way I see it anyway. So that you have then a quote like this from Jonathan Wells, who was in the video. It's becoming clearer and clearer to me that this is a materialistic philosophy masquerading as empirical science. In other words, where's the proof? Where's the science that backs up the claims? So if you're like me, you look at these textbooks and what's been taught for a number of years now, and you think, if you're going to put that there, if Haeckel's embryos can still be there, and how is that arriving at truth, the thing that we all want, this thing that science is searching after? So it's almost like the missing link that you hear about, and I want to say, where's the missing link called truth? How do we back that up with science? So in my mind, what isn't missing is the implications on society. If you follow evolution and if you believe that things spontaneously came about, life spontaneously erupted, then what is the effect on the thinking of society? If that's truth, if that's your starting point, and that's where you're going, then what do we have to live for? If you're an accident, if you're a product of evolutionary biology that just is now here and you don't know why, what does that lead to? You know the term relativism, right? Relativism says, I can do whatever I want. Why not? Who cares? If I'm an accident, it doesn't really matter. He gets to some of this in his book. For instance, William Provine's 5 Inescapable Conclusions on page 15 of my book, probably not in yours. So, what are the 5 inescapable conclusions? What if they are true? There is no evidence for God. What if that were true? I think what you'll find as we go through this class is that you'll see more and more evidence, more and more scientists saying that's not true. In fact, there's all kinds of evidence. But what kind of person, what kind of thinking, what kind of society does this lead to? What about this one? There's no life after death. You got one shot at it. Whatever your life is, that's all you got. That's a hard place to live. What about there's no absolute foundation for right and wrong? That's relativism. If it works for me, if it's right for me, why not? Who are you to tell me otherwise? You're just a product of evolution. What about this one? There's no ultimate meaning for life. Or perhaps even the last one, people don't really have free will. I don't know exactly what he meant by that. I can only imagine. But so free will is this idea that God has given you the ability to choose right from wrong. I guess if you don't have free will, then you can't really choose right from wrong. If it's all relative, it doesn't matter anyway. Is this a good foundation for life? Does this come from truth? Those are questions that we could ask. Daniel Dennett observed this. Darwinism is a universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview. I think we're now seeing the product of some of that worldview as it's played out over decades. Do you think so? Perhaps. So, purposelessness, void of meaning, those kinds of ideas. But what if the evidence points to intelligence in creation? So, if those icons of evolution that Patrick has brought to us tonight, if those aren't pointing to truth about evolution, and instead they've been proven to be, if not fraudulent, then at least bad experiments, such as Stanley Miller didn't have the right concepts, didn't have the right chemicals, and so on. So if that's true, then what about if we started looking at intelligence in creation? Interestingly, but I think not surprisingly to those of us who do have faith, science is actually beginning, I think, to help us in faith. That's where this book, as you continue to work through the material with us or read at home, I think that's what you'll begin to find, is that actually we're arriving at truth because science is making discoveries. So rather than science proving evolution and the lack of existence of a God who could create, rather than that, it's actually working the opposite direction. Which I think is, if it's not fun for God, it's at least fun for me. I mean, I don't know. I think we're beginning, the Romans 1 passage where the Creator can be seen from what is created. We're beginning to realize that the farther we go into science. To the point that 100 scientists, he mentions this in his book on page 32, 100 leading scientists published a scientific dissent from Darwinism. And this is what they said. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. We're skeptical. We don't believe you've got truth there. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. I love that. So they're basically saying, prove it. You believe that? Prove it. Show us the evidence. Show us the scientific reasoning behind what you're saying. And I think that's only fair, don't you? So then Walter Bradley would say this. I think people who believe that life emerged naturalistically need to have a great deal more faith in people who reasonably infer that there's an intelligent designer. When I read that quote, I thought, right on, that's exactly the way that I have felt for a long time. It takes a lot more faith to believe in evolution than it does an intelligent designer. I'm going to wrap up so we can get to Q&A with just a couple of more quotes here. Also found in the book. Again, we're trying to give you a real good sense of the book, even if you haven't had a chance this week to read it. Francis Crick. You need to know who this guy is. Let me back up. So, biochemist, Nobel Prize winner for discovering or sharing in the discovery, anyway, the molecular structure of DNA. I was actually the other one that discovered it with him. But yeah. What did we say about truth? He is also a spiritual skeptic. And this is what he had to say. An honest man, or woman, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which have led to, which would have led, I'm saying that wrong. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Sorry for my little flub there. There are so many conditions that would have had to be in place for this thing to accidentally get started. You can't call it a miracle, but it's almost a miracle. In other words, here's a skeptic saying, I have nothing. I can't explain it. I can't even imagine a way that it could have happened accidentally. Finally, Stephen Meyer, who will be interviewed in the book, and we'll talk more about him later on, says this. I don't believe I had this one. Maybe the world looks designed because it really is designed. Simple statement. A lot of truth. Maybe it looks that way because it really is. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. We'll both jump up here. I think what you can do right now is say, I'm confused. Go back to one of those icons. I've got a question. We'll be glad to do that. Maybe you've read further. You've got a comment of some kind, some type of redirect. Maybe one of these quotes stood out to you. Raise your hand and we'll start kicking some stuff around.
Those my age and older will probably remember in our biology textbooks somewhere around junior high, they explained evolution showing the common equine we know and love. And you started with a house cat-sized horse, or wasn't horse then, and it ended up becoming what we know now as a full-grown horse. And you had all these intermediate stages of life to get to the horse. I don't know, there were probably a dozen different pictures there. We all remember this. Yet, there was not a single fossil record for any of those transitional states. And the instructors never really pointed this out, and we were too stupid as junior high kids to even ask. And then, my question is, though, Darwin had made the comment 150 years ago, my theory will stand or fall on the fossil record.
Yeah.
Now, paleontology wasn't a new science in the mid-1800s. I mean, it had been a while, been going on for a while. Didn't know as much as we know now. But his theory was based on something that he himself said didn't exist. There was no fossil record to support his theory at the time. Now, he was hoping, I guess, that 150 years later, there would be a fossil record to support it. But now we still have in textbooks something that we very well know there's no fossil record to support. So here's my question. How could he have come up with the theory so lame-brained to begin with when he didn't have the fossil record to support it? And how could we, 150 years later, be still buying into it?
I was going to ask you that same question.
I mean, to me, that goes back to the philosophical part of that, starting with the philosophy.
I think personally that they're trying to get rid of an absolute moral law so that they can have their own morals.
So trying to get rid of an absolute moral law so they can have their own morals,
Not
is
so
what Lee said.
necessarily so they can force it on us, but so if they get rid of God, then anything they decide is right is right.
But you would think that it has to be some modicum of realistic science to fool as many people as they have, but yet they've been able to fool with very, very, very well, non-existent science.
Yeah,
I mean,
so-
paleontologists, modern-day paleontologists are jumping from the Darwin ship right and left even today because there's no evidence to support it.
Yeah.
And so I'm just bumfuzzled at how this has happened for generation after generation, and we just continue to put up with it.
I think I know the answer to that question.
Take a crack at it.
You know, you quoted Romans 1 is what you were quoting
Yeah.
a moment ago. And that we can chuckle at this, but if you read it, it says in Romans 1 that those who chose to not believe that God exists, he gave them over to a depraved mind, thinking what was true was not true. To me, that affirms the evidence of that is before us. God said, if you choose to believe that I'm not here, I'm going to give you over to the depraved mind. That's why people believe that.
A couple of other thoughts, you know, kind of going along with that. 2 Corinthians talks about, I think chapter 4 talks about the God of this age has blinded them. So there's a blinding that's happening. And I think that's where speaking truth helps. But there was also, you know, if you go back to the Enlightenment and the age of enlightenment where we can arrive at knowledge and understanding and we can test things and scientifically prove things. That was such a grand idea. It was changing the world. So it fits right in line with where Darwin was going, and it was almost as though he was saying, here's the philosophy. Now, hopefully the fossil record will catch up with it. But they were so wanted the philosophy to be right. So that, again, the Enlightenment, the idea was, we don't need God anymore. So if we can do that, then now we've gotten rid of God. Now maybe we can have our own morals, or we can at least be free from the shackles of religion, not knowing that Christianity really sets you free. At least that's my take on it.
And Wells said something to the effect of that they had a theory, and then they were going to find evidence that then fit their theory. So when he said that he needed to see transitional forms, it was like, click, there's Ophiopteryx.
Yeah. And fraud after fraud
Yeah.
after fraud after
So,
fraud. You know.
yeah, it was kind of a self-fulfilling.
I was just going to say, you know, in science, it often works to come up with a theory and then go look for something to prove that theory. And it is Darwin's theory, not Darwin's proof. I mean, Einstein had the same, you know, he theorized a number of things that he couldn't prove that were later proved through observation and through the mathematics. So it's not a big stretch for us. It's just that often science will grab hold of these ideas and hold on to them with faith.
Yeah.
And I think all of this comes back down to that. You're going to believe in something.
Yeah. And I don't have a problem with someone presenting a theory
Right.
and then looking for science to prove it. That's not a problem for me. What's a problem for me, maybe for you, is where science states it as a fact in textbooks and in nature shows, and it says this is what happened. That's a problem because it has not been proven. In fact, just the opposite has happened. So it really bothers me. It kind of goes back to that humility conversation that we were talking about, to say, wait a minute, let's not assume so much.
I also wanted to say, I think with Darwin, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we can, we can go, we look at all of that Darwin speak and we see selection. Well, we know selection is real. Anybody that's bred dogs, bred hamsters, you bred horses, whatever, you breed animals and plants looking for specific traits, specific outcomes. I think where the wheels fall off of that argument is the result. The output. You don't breed dogs looking for horses. You breed dogs looking for for more dogs.
Right.
It's just that in result
Yeah.
that we have to question.
Mandy, and after Mandy, I would really like to know if there are any questions of confusion, like anything we can clear up before we run out of time. But Mandy, what do you?
I was going to go off that. I wasn't in college too long ago, and so they often use like a bait and switch, approach where like obviously natural selection is true, like we see that happening, and so they act like well then it all must be true. So like it all falls under one another. So just something to be aware of, and with your kids in school.
So do you remember science classes in college that were doing that very thing?
Very much.
Yeah.
Very
So one more,
Probably-
like he said.
Yeah, Jack.
It sounds like science is undergoing their own evolution.
Yeah.
Evolving-
Yeah, that's true.
Evolving toward intelligent design,
Yeah.
it seems. And so why are the textbooks catching up with that?
Well, that would probably be like who's in power,
Yeah.
who's making the call on the textbooks kind of thing. And it's unfortunately not these leading scientists, because they're all saying the same thing you're saying. Anything we need to clear up? Patrick is available. You got this guy right
I
here.
have one question for Patrick based on his statements earlier about the four theories. You had said you were a 14-year student of studying this, and you had presented the four theories, young Earth, old Earth, etc. So I think we would all like to know, since you've got a lot of time invested and energy invested in this, which are the four theories you support?
The ones that we talked about last week?
Yeah.
Marshall and I have talked about this, that throughout our study of this, we have bounced back and forth. Where I would say a year ago, I was probably more on the young Earth side. But after studying the thoughts of the Hebrew people, I'm going more towards old Earth. So,
Most of us are kind of going toward old.
yeah. All of us are.
Some of you are showing I had a question back there.
I cannot remember the name of it. It's the explosion, the C, it starts with a C, Cambrian explosion. It doesn't prove, we talked about how it doesn't prove his theories and stuff, but what does it prove? Like,
That's a great question.
That is a great question. I think scientists are going to be debating that question for a long time. So based off of your presuppositions, you're going to answer that question differently, okay? When I see that, I think of more of an intelligent designer. You can also say that something, there was some input into the system that created this explosion. So that's my question, is what could have caused that? When we see a big fossil record like that, and I need to do my research, but talking about massive floods, okay? And it takes very unique conditions to create fossils, okay? And almost, they have to die and almost instantly be covered up, right? So there had to be something also traumatic at that event when we see the fossil records. So I'll just throw that out there and say that that's one thought.
One thing I would add to that, and I've got a video on my Facebook page if you wanted to go check that out, about information, and we're going to get, in future weeks, we'll talk about DNA and where information comes from. May even show this same video I'm talking about. But the question about the Cambrian explosion to me is if life requires information in the form of DNA in order to be generated, in other words, for us to have that form, there's a lot of information required. Where did all that information suddenly come from? For us to have an explosion, I love the clock. You remember the clock in the video, 24-hour clock? Got all the way around to 21 hours, and then suddenly he said in a period of 2 minutes on a 24-hour clock, 2 minutes, boom, there it is. Huh. Makes me think of something I've read before, you know. It's kind of the way I think about that. We will get more into that, but I think it does prove, in my mind, it does. Well, I don't know if we can use the word prove. Could we use the word prove? We couldn't use the word prove. This is part of that humility thing. Let's not let faith do that either. But what we believe is, and what you would have to look at is, how did that information, all those life forms suddenly appear? I think it points to intelligent design, for sure.
So when Marshall read the quote up there about how skepticism needs to be in place when dealing with evolution, we can flip that coin on its side and say that skepticism needs to be in place when talking about Christianity. And that's my challenge to you tonight, would be to go home and think about why you have faith in Jesus Christ. And so we can battle this all day long, but in the end, flip the coin over. Why do we have the faith in Christ that we do?
Mark, would you set these where they could be? Grab a handout on the way out.
Email, talk to us.
You know, one thought about it, the humility, what Patrick just said, is that as you're talking with friends who may not believe in intelligent design, and you mentioned Cambrian explosion, do it with a lot of humility with them. Don't feel like it's a trump card, or any of this information is a trump card that you're going to hit them over the head. You cannot refute that. Just let it be a conversation. And I believe what happens is when someone looks enough at what truth is, if they're desiring truth, they'll begin to put the pieces together. They'll begin to see it. And I think that's my encouragement to you. Don't rule this thing with an iron fist. I will try not to do that too.
Cosmology next week?
Yeah, a chapter that I love, cosmology. So chapter 5, if you're keeping up with the reading, we are starting on time in this class. So if you're not here at 6:30, we've already started. So try your best to get kids dropped off and get in here. We're doing that so we can get information out to you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Patrick, great job tonight. And let us know how you're tracking with us and what we need to do differently, if anything, to help you. All right? God bless.